In 1959, Students for a Democratic Society was founded and a meeting was held in Ann Arbor, Michigan. At this meeting, Robert Allen Haber was elected president and Tom Hayden wrote the Port Huron Statement. For handing out these pamphlets, California Berkeley said things that discouraged the idea of politics on campus. This whole entire speaking out was coming about due to the free speech movement that happened in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. Students for a Democratic Society disliked the Cold War and didn't believe that the hostility was necessary. The Students for a Democratic Society movement really began the New Left movement in the United States as a whole. The New Left is a political ideology that developed in the early 1960s, which mainly encompassed college students who became inspired by the African American civil rights movement. Followers of the New Left were adhered to somewhat socialist ideas and were focused on protecting the environment, anti-war protests, feminism, and strong emotionally driven policies that stemmed away from the traditional Democratic Party, also known as the Old Left. Though they had no unified, concrete beliefs, they tended to focus on these subjects. The New Left group, Students for a Democratic Society, was founded by college students to organize their political presence in protests and opinions and policy. They were most likely driven to take action because of the Vietnam War, which became extremely unpopular because of the New Left movement. Students for a Democratic Society was also in support for racial equality within the United States and quickly made their voices heard on such issues.
The Port Huron Statement was a statement composed by the Students for a Democratic Society to basically express their feelings about the 1960s.
The Students for a Democratic Society was on a rise and needed to let the nation know exactly what they were about. Students from the University of Michigan gathered in Port Huron, Michigan, to determine just what America needed to know about them and what they wanted. Well-known social activist Tom Hayden coordinated the meeting and became the driving force behind the creation of the Port Huron Statement. Tom Hayden and other students present at the meeting began stating the problems of the American life in the eyes of their new generation. They pointed out how their generation grew up believing America was unstoppable and invincible, being the only one with the atomic bomb and being able to help anyone they could. They believed America could use its wealth and power to influence the world with American values of freedom and equality for everyone. Next, they realized that America was not following their own values of freedom and equality and noticed the heavy segregation and awful racism that happened in the nation. They saw how weak America really was, and that because of the Cold War, they knew they could die at any instant because of nuclear bombs. Hayden and the other students continue to show how America no longer follows their own values, and they demonstrate how values in America could be relieved. This speech vitalized the movement of the Students for a Democratic Society and helped them pursue their ultimate goal.
The free speech movement was a movement conducted by college students around the nation to fight for their free speech in political activities.
One of the biggest issues that Tom Hayden and the students listed in the Port Huron Statement was the widespread segregation and awful racism in the United States. The Students for a Democratic Society started their fight against segregation after incidents occurred on February 1st, 1960, with Joseph McNeil, Franklin McCain, David Richmond, and Ezel Blair walked into a whites-only restaurant and demanded service from the restaurant. The restaurant denied their request, and the students sat in the restaurant protesting their service. Sit-ins in restaurants continued to grow, and students all over the South were protesting restaurant services. As sit-ins grew in popularity, a conference was formed in April of 1960 by Martin Luther King Jr., the famous activist. He called it the Southwide Student Leadership Conference on Nonviolent Resistance to Segregation. Dozens of students in the South came together to discuss their roles in the movement for civil rights. This conference soon formed into a more structured committee called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as the SNCC. One of the things the SNCC coordinated were freedom rides in support of Rosa Parks. After Rosa Parks stood up for her rights and did not give up her seat to a white person on a public bus, students all over the South followed her example and filled dozens of buses with African American students and refused to exit the buses. Unfortunately, one of these freedom rides led to a brutal beating to African American students from the white supremacists. A bus traveling from New Orleans to Washington, D.C. was stopped by a group in Anniston, Alabama, and the white supremacists there beat the bus with whatever was in their hand. They soon opened the doors, dragged students out of the bus, and beat them with pipes, sticks, and wood. After they were done beating the African American students, they lit the bus on fire to show their power.
Students for a Democratic Society were also active in the civil rights movement, participating in peaceful protests.
One of the largest incidents that occurred involving students and their freedom of speech was the Berkeley incident. The incident started dating back to the 1950s when Senator McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, gained public recognition for claiming that a large number of people involved with the government were in fact communists. His claims about the government worried everyone from the government to the general public. After the claims were released, the University of California, Berkeley became extremely worried of communism infiltrating their university. In order to protect themselves and the students, the university decided to harshly limit the students' freedom of speech and did not allow them to participate in political activities on and off campus. When the 1960s came around, students began to ignore the rules placed on them, and professors helped students exercise their freedom of speech and practice their political views off of campus. Soon, students were being recruited by various organizations to help protest against various things, and soon dozens of students of the University of Berkeley were arrested because of these organizations. After learning about this, the University of California, Berkeley ordered students to no longer participate in any political activities near the campus. After hearing the news, famous activist Mario Savio and almost 500 other students marched to the University of California, Berkeley's administration building in protest of the new ban. Other recognized organizations joined the protest and forced the university to make a compromise. Savio and the Berkeley free speech movement continued to fight for their free speech in the university, claiming that the First Commandment was the only way to student activities. Finally, on December 2nd, 1964, Savio and 5,000 students gathered to strike against the university's administration, claiming that they were bringing down the university's machine. 1,500 of Savio's supporters conducted a sit-in inside the administration building, and police came in and violently removed the sit-in participants and eventually arrested Mario Savio. The university and the Board of Regents continued to fight against the free speech movement, but the university elected a new chancellor in support of the students, and with his first acts as chancellor, granted the students' demand for free speech.
During this segment, Students for a Democratic Society will be referred to as SDS. The main driving force of the SDS was the Vietnam War, because they saw a problem with kids going to fight a war that they do not want to fight. Many college kids at this time turned to the SDS for guidance and even got some. The movement organized protests, which ranged from peaceful to destructive. When the SDS marched on DC, they chanted things like, "Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" the SDS also did things such as burn draft papers, occupy campus buildings, and militant activity. A lot of the time when the students would take over administrative buildings on campus, the protests would be put down with violence, which would cause the more and more people to support the cause of the SDS. During the Vietnam War, a dangerous offshoot of the SDS, called the Weathermen, started to use terrorist attacks to make their point heard. The underground was known for supporting communist ideas, which caused many people to go after them. This painted a very bad image for the SDS because it made them look evil. After LBJ left office, President Nixon tried to go along with what the SDS was saying, but also had to police arrest more people that were against the war effort to make it look like the SDS was now supporting the war. However, President Nixon failed and the SDS continued strong for all of the Vietnam War, but after the war, the SDS fell apart. The problem was that the movement had so much behind the war that when it ended, most of the members couldn't find a reason to stay, so they left because the war was the only part of the movement that they really supported.
The FBI said the Weather Underground organization, which took credit for the bombing, is the same radical group which was responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Capitol in 1971 and the Pentagon in 1972.
Hello. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. Kids know the lines are drawn. Revolution is touching all of our lives.
This system is going to be overthrown. It's going to mean a fight. And it's going to mean a lot of white people risking a lot of things.
Don't ever say we're going into a revolution. We're in a revolution. Now the question is, who's going to win it?
Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. Within the next 14 days, we will attack a symbol or institution of American injustice.
Anyone who does have any information on where these people are located should immediately contact the FBI.
There's no way to be committed to nonviolence in the middle of the most violent society that history's ever created. I'm not committed to nonviolence in any way.
When you feel that you have right on your side, you can do some horrific things.
Students for a Democratic Society played a great deal in precedence for the Democratic Party. It inspired a generation of young, radical thinkers to speak out and take action against traditional American values. Because of this, new generations of young people on the left continued to be outspoken and take action against policies that they deem racist, violent, or hurtful to the American people. New movements have started in the Democratic Party, such as Black Lives Matter, alongside various others. In short, the Black Lives Matter movement was a string of protests aimed at stopping police brutality directed towards African Americans. This movement is very similar to those in the 1960s performed by Students for a Democratic Society. In the late 1990s, President Bill Clinton issued many policies, including the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law for homosexuals permitted in the military. This also stems from the New Left movements that began in the 1960s that still exist to this day. The left is still fighting for equal rights of all people and not to discriminate against any person's color, creed, or preferences.
And it's like high to the left.
I want to die. All right.